very pleased and proud to welcome an extraordinary man who I am happy to call an old friend as well. Edgar Mitchell. Ed is one of the people who actually walked on the moon. In fact, he's the sixth man to walk on the moon. I'm sure every one of you know exactly who Ed Mitchell is. He literally needs no introduction. But what does need an introduction, and it's getting it here, is an extraordinary book, The Way of the Explorer. Larry Dossey said of it, and I thought this was particularly apt of the many, many comments that Edgar got for this book. In the history of the human race, 12 people have set foot on the moon. Now, one of them has written an important book, an account of a modern-day hero's journey. Like the mythical heroes of legend, astronaut Mitchell pursued a vision, ventured on a quest, risked great danger, and obtained uncommon wisdom. He has returned to share it, and we would be wise to listen. Yes, indeed, we would. And over the course of the program, as I am sure Edgar well knows, we will be talking also about aliens. By the way, for you subscribers, one of the other people who has given Edgar a lovely quote for his book, Lynn McTaggart, is our featured subscriber interview this week. And Ed, I think in view of that, I might start out by departing a little bit from, if I have a script, and I never really do, and asking you what your thoughts are about the Lynn McTaggart and the intention experiment. We're going to get into the quantum physical nature of consciousness as Ed sees it a little later, but let's just start there, since we're talking also today to Lynn McTaggart.
I have skimmed her new book. I have not personally read every word of it through, Whitley, but of course her first book, The Field, I'm very intimately involved with, and I appreciate Lynn's approach. I know that she's a very thorough researcher, but I can't speak to the details of this newest book because I haven't read it word for word all the way through yet.
Well, let's really. I guess I misspoke myself because I meant to say that I'd like to talk about the theory of the field and to move from that into your idea of quantum awareness.
Okay.
And I think that I think you could probably make it a bit more of a response to that.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I certainly agree that in recent years we have, and fortunately in large measure due to some work a colleague of mine did that Lynn McTaggart's quite well aware of, Dr. Walter Schimp in Germany, discovered this process called quantum holography when he was doing work with improving MRI machines. He's an MRI expert. And it really brings into clear focus the role of the quantum world in our perceptual machinery and in the concept of the quantum field as an underlying aspect of nature that we're just now really starting to learn a bit about. And primarily because for 80 years since the discovery of quantum mechanics, the particle physicists have insisted that it really didn't pertain to our scale size, that this was a property only of subatomic matter. Well, it so happens that it may be a property of subatomic matter, but it has enormous influence because we have a lot of subatomic matter in us, too, on the way humans function, and particularly our perceptual machinery.
Exactly, and this is incredibly important because let's talk about a little bit about the so-called quantum perception problem so folks can get a bit of an idea about just how important this actually is. Because if perception influences reality or even assembles reality in some way, then our place in the universe is actually very different from what we've assumed. Wouldn't that be true?
That's absolutely correct. And what we're getting past here is the classical physics that stems from the time of Isaac Newton, but for our readers to understand this, that the Cartesian duality from René Descartes of the late 16th, early 17th century came to the conclusion that body, mind, physicality, spirituality belong to two different realms of reality that don't interact. Now, the fine aspect of that, the positive aspect of that, was it got the Inquisition of the Church of that period off the backs of the intellectuals, and they quit burning them at stake and torturing them on the rack, which was what the Inquisition did in those days with dissenters. And it did allow a science, as we now understand it in the classical period of Newton and the early great thinkers, to arise. But it has progressed for almost 400 years with religion on one hand and science on the other, and never the twain shall meet, until the 20th century and quantum mechanics came along and clearly indicated that there was something here wrong with that notion that body, mind, physicality, and spirituality don't interact. And it's very clear that they do interact now. And that is the major contribution in the 20th century here of quantum mechanics, and particularly the new stuff that's been going on in just the last few years, thanks to much of the work that I've been doing, Lynn McTaggart's been doing, and many of the great thinkers associated here with the consciousness movement.
Now let's talk a little bit about quantum awareness and how it's different from ordinary awareness. And in this audience that you're talking to now is engaged in an intense search. It's an audience of about 250,000 people, and they are not like your usual radio audience. These people they know what this is. So when we talk about quantum awareness, you're talking to people who are actively engaged in trying to rethink or re-experience their awareness and the way they work in relation to the universe itself.
Okay, well, maybe I can lay a little background here that at least from the academic end and the teaching end and the scientific end, that helps get the proper idea across. Because we need to understand what is different about classical thinking in physics and in science rather than quantum thinking in science. And it has to do with four properties of nature that define the quantum world, and that is entanglement, coherence, non-locality, and resonance. That are the aspects of the quantum world that are vitally important here. Entanglement is this notion that subatomic matter that becomes in a process, and even if the particles go apart from each other, even across the universe, they remain entangled in some very mysterious way, such that if you do something to one particle, the other one immediately and instantaneously responds regardless of where it is in the universe.
Right, and the interesting thing about this is, folks, this has been physically proved. It's not.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, there have been experiments that have shown this is definitely real.
Yes, that's correct. It is a real phenomenon. And that just shows that it goes right to the heart of the fact that the universe is mysteriously in some way interconnected, and we will call this an informational interconnection at that level that still has a lot of mystery associated with it. And non-locality, which is part one of these, coherence, that these two particles are coherent in a way. A way to think of coherence, if you think of it as light waves being coherent, it means that their waves are all lined up kind of in a row like soldiers marching, as opposed to being like just ordinary light coming in where the waveforms are in all sorts of angles and not lined up in any way. The light that comes through your window and from the sun is not coherent light, but laser light is coherent light. And laser light is what we've discovered. But what we've now discovered is that that nature was using this property long before we discovered it. And that's that's a very interesting observation. And then non-locality is the idea that this information between the two is transported, or is the interaction is instantaneously recognized, regardless of where the other part is in the universe. Well, this kind of challenges Einstein's concept that information doesn't move faster than the speed of light. But here we have validated that this is absolutely true, that it does. Exactly how this happens, still the methodology and the mechanism for it is still very elusive, but the fact that it does happen, that's not in question anymore. And a couple of other things to illustrate this among we humans is a so-called twin effect, that twins who are on opposite sides of the country from each other, or around the world from each other, might on any given day dress in the same color clothes or have the same sort of thoughts or be in kind of communication with each other. Another example is Mom and Dad go out for dinner at night and leaving Johnny at home with a babysitter, and halfway through dinner, Mom jumps up and says, "Oh, something's happened to Johnny." Calls home, babysitter answers, says, "Well, yes, he fell out of his high chair onto his head and bumped his head." Well, that's the type of information, we call it quantum coherence or quantum entanglement and quantum resonance, that allows that to take place. And go ahead.
Now that we're seeing this, it becomes possible, and this is why I see such a relationship between your work and the work of someone like Lynn McTaggart, is that you are leading the way into a new possibility, which is that once we understand the theory that would explain what is now dismissed by science as mere psychic activity or superstition, then suddenly everything changes, because in the quantum nature of the mind, once we understand this in our linear mind, it's going to enable our quantum mind to function more freely. Now, Edgar, we've come to the quantum minds. We've come to the end of our first segment, so we're going to stop here for just a moment, folks, and we'll be right back. Today I'm talking to one of the great explorers of our time, Dr. Edgar Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell's new book is The Way of the Explorer, an Apollo astronaut's journey through the material and mystical worlds, and it is powerful. This is a working document for those of you who are working on creating or recreating your mind as a quantum mind, and I know a lot of you are, because this is what we work on in our meditations all the time in the subscribers section. Well, this book helps because it brings into coherent understanding and ceases to make mysterious things that are mysterious now, and this empowers us. So it's incredibly exciting. Edgar's website is edmitchellapollo14.com, and that's the numbers 14. That's edmitchellapollo14.com. And of course, he's the founder of the Institute for Noetic Sciences, and this is a marvelous and extraordinary organization that you are much commended to get involved in. It is Noetic, Noetic.org. And the Institute of Noetic Sciences is taking certain things very, very far, and it is well worth your time. Edgar, when we left the air, we were beginning to talk about the quantum mind. And what, if you could describe for us what is the quantum mind? How would it be different?
Okay, sure. First of all, let's use a couple of metaphors to get the idea across. We have called intuition our sixth sense, but in fact, we should be calling it our first sense because it's rooted in quantum reality and quantum properties, which have been around long before our solar system or our planet has. It's the most basic way that nature transmits information, and so we can call that our sixth sense, or rather our first sense instead of our sixth sense. Now, in addition, one of the properties that helps us recognize this is that we have a mechanism called a Faraday cage, which screens out electromagnetic signaling. And waves like radio waves and television waves can't get through a Faraday cage, but we can put parents, our lovers, our parents and children, or any people that are simpatico or know each other, one inside a Faraday cage and the other outside, wire them up to EEG machines, and tell them to think about each other. And lo and behold, in spite of the fact that they're separated by a Faraday cage and screening, their brain waves can go in sync. And this is one way we test all of that. And it so happens we test it continually, and it's the way the world works here. And so the very basis of our perceptual machinery, and it explains all of our psychic stuff, but it's even the basis for our normal perception, is rooted in these quantum properties of nature that we're talking about.
So, what we're looking at then is the actual truth is that the linear mind is a kind of filter. It's not the real mind, and this is about working around or realizing that filter is just that. Ironically, the illusion isn't quantum reality. The illusion is mechanistic reality. Would that be directionally correct?
Well, yes. I think we have to say that our perceptual mechanisms require both, because our normal sensory mechanisms, the 5 so-called normal senses, are built upon the particular attributes of the solar system and the planetary system that we live in. So our visual acuity is attuned to the brightness and the lightness of the light produced by our sun. Our acoustic ability, listening and hearing, is due to the particular constituents of our atmosphere. So we evolved being able to utilize that sort of information. But at the very basis of it is a quantum reality. Now, we have learned to use this, for example, let me digress and use this for this example, that in our telescopes, in the great astronomical observatories,
right,
in Hawaii and in Chile, and et cetera,
right,
they have a way of reducing the twinkle, and it's tied with exactly what we're talking about. To see clearer into the heavens is that you have to eliminate the twinkle or the waveforms that are disturbed by the light coming through the atmosphere of our planet. And they do that by sending a laser beam into the atmosphere, catching the reflection from that laser beam back, because that represents the atmospheric interference, and removing the image from the image of the light, this noise, and getting a very clear picture of the heavens. That's using lasers to correct for the atmospheric interference, and we know how to do that. And the same thing is true here with our brain-mind. When we learn how to meditate and use our brain-mind differently, we can eliminate the noise. We can start to get more clear signaling. And the ancients have been doing this and knowing this for centuries. For centuries,
yes. It's as if,
with our meditation techniques.
It's as if we're recovering something, not discovering something.
Yes, that's right. We're recovering. And with our thinking minds, our rational thinking brains, as we discovered to use that and used our language, we started to abandon these deep intuitive things. Now, we've always had them, but we've focused more on our rational thinking brain mind than we have on the deep mind. that carries this sort of information.
The way of the explorer kept hitting me between the eyes, Edgar, and one of the most powerful sentences I've ever read anywhere, folks, and this is because this sentence deals so directly with exactly the kind of change we are all looking for and we know is out there. Listen to this. Non-local resonance with any part of the space-time universe should be attainable by shifting one's point of focus to the 0 point, for it resonates with all matter. Now that reads to me, Edgar, like a practical, down-to-earth, meditative technique, which I suspect that is there. And the question first is, and this is amply discussed in this marvelous book, is your definition of the 0 point. When we are out there in our meditative space, what are we looking for when we're looking for the 0 point?
Well, first of all, let's define what we're talking about here. It was discovered over a century ago by the great physicist Max Planck that all matter emits and reabsorbs energy and photons of energy. And at that point in history, we still weren't sure whether light was a particle or a wave, and the argument's been going back since Greek times. But at that point in time, Einstein and Max Planck and the physicists of that period came to the conclusion. Einstein wrote the famous paper that said light is either particle or wave, depending upon what experiment you do with it. So it has both aspects. And very shortly we discovered that all matter at that level has both wave and particle aspects, depending upon the experiments you do with it. Well, that was the beginning of quantum mechanics. Now, what the physicists have done for almost 80 years, once they discovered that, was they kept studying and deeper, how do these little particles split up, recombine, what's their properties? But what they didn't do was look at it until very recently as the fact that as a group, and now let me use this idea to get it across. If you look at your fingertip and you look at the ridge on your finger, it doesn't tell you much about you. But if you look at the pattern of ridges on all 10 fingers and think of it as a pattern, that's your fingerprint. It uniquely identifies you. Well, what a colleague of mine in Europe, Dr. Walter Schempp, did about 15 years ago now, was study this as a group of emissions. And he discovered that if you consider the group emissions from every physical object, it carries unique information about that physical object. And it doesn't matter whether it's a light bulb in your house, your chair, your dog, an organ of your body. Everything is emitted and reabsorbing this energy. And in some areas, and sometimes we call that an aura. I mean, it's got many properties, but one of the properties that Schempp discovered was that the photons are non-local and are interconnected, and they carry information. Now, to leap a little bit ahead, the ancients knew this, but they didn't know it quite the way we do it with quantum mechanics. And they called that particular property the Akashic record. And
it's absolutely fascinating because we've speculated on this show for years about the nature of the Akashic record. Fascinating. Go ahead.
Well, exactly what we're talking about here is that Dr. Schempp discovered precisely that the emissions from each physical object, when considered as a group and managed with a particular mathematic called the nilpotent Dirac-Heisenberg Lie group algebra. Now, that's a mouthful. Don't worry about it. But that's the mathematics involved. And he discovered that we have this quantum property, and it is a non-local property, and it carries information about us, and it is the basis, and I happened to discover then, I wrote a paper called nature's mind, the quantum hologram, because that's exactly how our psychic stuff works. And this has been slowly filtering into the community, scientific community, as these ideas are being accepted more and more.
And folks, I just want to point out briefly that you can read that paper on Edgar's website, edmitchellapollo14.com. Go ahead, Ed.
Thank you. Well, we consider that this discovery of Dr. Sims has opened an entirely new door for us to look at biology, to look at the questions of, well, what is really life, and what is the difference between, we think, we're told chemically that our bodies are made up of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, or oxygen primarily, but we ask the question, what's the difference between the carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, and oxygen in our bodies and what's in the inanimate stuff out in nature? Well, one of the answers is it's all quantum entangled, and only now are we really starting to understand that.
Which is a huge, huge thing. And, folks, we're going to drop the break because I'm too excited. I can't go on a break right now. So, please, if you don't subscribe to Unknown Country, do so. That's what keeps this all going. Okay, let's continue. Now, what you're saying there leads me to think, you speak a little bit in the book about remote viewing, and you've had experience of it. You know that it works. Are you saying that this entanglement with the rest of the world is what enables, it's the mechanism that enables things like remote viewing to happen?
Oh, absolutely. That's absolutely true.
That's absolutely fascinating.
Absolutely true.
And how far does entanglement go?
Well, what do you mean by how far?
Well, I mean, are we entangled? We're entangled with the world around us, but are we entangled, therefore, with the whole universe, or?
Well, that's a good question. You see, we can't really experiment much beyond what we can observe in our universe, but it would seem so. If the laws of physics are the same in our universe, throughout our universe, as most scientists believe that they are, then yes, these same principles apply. Now, we can say for sure that has been tested, if we have molecules entangled in a particular process, they are entangled, and they exhibit these properties until they get entangled somewhere else. But there's this entanglement. And presumably, if the Big Bang is really the right answer to how all of our reality came about, then everything is entangled. But
it must be, because it all started out as a tiny, super dense object the size of a fist or a golf ball.
That is true, except for the fact there is a great deal of doubt at this point in time in many quarters, not all quarters, it's standard academic dogma. There's considerable doubt that the Big Bang is really the right answer to all of this.
Well, which is in and of itself fascinating. I do know that there is a group of cosmologists who announced a few months ago, in December, that they thought that a 9 billion light-year gap in the universe that they have observed is an indication that another entire universe... What'd you say?
Yeah, that another universe or even another set of processes are taking place.
Right, beyond what we can see, beyond the limits of our own universe.
One of the things we have to recognize here that keeps us all fairly humble, or should, is the fact that when we start to think about and you look at the photographs from the Hubble telescope into the immensity of everything that we could see, and we've only had these photographs working for us for the last decade or so, we're only just now discovering really the immensity of what we call our universe. And we are really very ignorant, frankly. We're just barely out of the trees when it comes to really understanding what's going on. So we think we're pretty smart, and yes, our science of the late 20th, 19th, and 20th century, and now the 21st century is carrying us very fast. But, folks, we still got a long ways to go.
Well, yeah, because, you speak of us being just recently out of the trees. In the Earth's time, in geologic time, we have only been around for less than a geologic second. We are. You talk about peripheral and transient phenomena. Human intelligence is extremely peripheral and extremely transient right now. Edgar, and this is an outrageously unfair question, but you are probably one of the only people on Earth I would ever ask this and expect to hear an answer that's worth hearing, and that is, where do you think we are going?
Where we're going, Where we're going is where we choose to go. And right now we are imperiling our entire environment because we're not being very wise. At this point in our history, since the end of the 19th and throughout the 20th century, we have had an upturn in all activity. Just because of the genius of our science and our technology people, because of the sudden influence of modern medicine and extending the lifespan. Population, which was less than 2 billion people on Earth at the beginning of the 20th century, is over 6.5 billion now, so we've far more than tripled ourselves in 1 century. And the upshot of it is that every measure of human activity is on an exponential growth curve. Every measure of human activity is on an exponential growth curve.
Yeah, and mathematically,
that means that the rate is fast. The rate of change is changing faster also. And it doesn't take great genius to understand that exponential growth can't continue indefinitely in a finite space, and we live on a finite planet.
Right.
So something's got to give. Something's got to change. And we caused it. We got to change it. So that is the current dilemma of modern civilization that we're facing right now, Whitley, and I'm sure you know that too.
Absolutely, of course.
Part of our sustainability.
Written some books about it.
Yeah. So that's the major lesson. And so where we're going is where we have to go. We either got to wake up and start to protect our environment, cut back on our insane consumption, and start to learn how to live in cooperation with each other, or we're going to extinguish ourselves.
You have said, and this takes me in a slightly different direction. You've said some of the more interesting things about the possibility of alien presence in this world than that I've heard, and of course, you and I have personally talked about it since I had an extensive amount of contact with something or somebody.
Yep.
And so I have wondered what I see two things happening. I see the world is in this state exactly that you describe. And at the same time, I see this other presence that is sort of like it's if I may use a kind of a simple analogy, it's like some enormous presence, immensely knowledgeable, more than a little dangerous, and more than a little potentiating to us, kind of sticking a little stick into the ant nest and rubbing it around a bit and causing us to look up. And I'm wondering how you react to that.
Well, you, of course, have not come right out and said it, but I know we've been visited and have had it, although I have not had personal sighting of our visitors or personal sighting of UFOs. I have been briefed by, since I grew up in Roswell, New Mexico, by the way, which our readers may not know, our listeners may not know.
Yeah, I was actually going to get to that very soon. It's quite remarkable. And when we're going to take a break in a couple of minutes, folks, and when we come back, we'll talk about a little bit about Edgar's rather the amazing milieu in which he was raised, and then what happened on the Apollo 14 mission. But let's go ahead with this now.
Well, I grew up in Roswell. I knew many of the people, local people, or my family did, involved in the so-called Roswell incident. And so, to make a long story short, there's no doubt that it was covered up, that the Roswell incident was a valid visitation, that an accident did happen there, a crashed UFO. And not only have I had that confirmed by folks that my family knew in the Roswell area, but over the years, because of my astronaut experience, what I called old-timers contacted me, or somehow we came together, that were knowledgeable in this because they were there. They were either in the military or they were in the intelligence service or sometime at that point and had these types of experiences or were involved with it. And so I, at one point, went to the Pentagon because I had connections there and asked to talk to some fairly high-level people, which a meeting was set up. And so I showed I told what I knew. And the officer there, who was quite a high-level officer, said, I don't know about this, but I should know about this because it should be. That's part of my job. And so a few weeks later, he went back and said, you're right. And then he started to try to break in because he said, this should be my job. I should be in charge of this. And he was denied access. Now, we know that quite a number of our people over the years, since the 1950s, when all of this started to take place, have been denied access. But it's opening up fairly rapidly these days after all of this time. And I have the feeling that before very long, the fact of alien presence will be quite well accepted and quite, whether it will really be fully acknowledged, I don't know. But certainly a number of governments around the world that are well aware of this, like the Belgian government, the French government, the Brazilian government, the Mexican government, have fully acknowledged their files and their knowledge of the UFO phenomenon.
Folks, we're going to take a little break right now. We'll be right back. We're talking to Dr. Ed Mitchell. His new book, The Way of the Explorer, an Apollo astronaut's journey through the material and mystical worlds. Do not miss this, because if you are on this journey into quantum mind, as I know most of you listening to this are, this book is important. It's real important. Don't miss it. The information in here is valuable. It will help you take this journey. Ed is probably the world's leading explorer for the simple reason that he not only has he walked on the moon among the sixth man to do so, but he has taken the potency or the magic or the power of that journey and internalized it and re-expressed it as a new journey into inner and outer space that all of us can take. Don't miss his website, edmitchellapollo14.com, and explore the Institute for Noetic Sciences as well. That's noetic.org, noetic.org. Now, Edgar, let's begin this last segment together, going back to the moon and to that remarkable experience that really empowered your whole journey. What exactly happened? That sense of connectedness that you talk about. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure.
Because that's what we're really looking at here.
Be glad to do that, Whitney. Let's set it up for our listeners. Because I was a lunar module pilot, and my responsibilities were the lunar spacecraft and the lunar surface activities, to know those like the back of my hand and be an expert in them. And on the way home, since my major job had been completed successfully, and I was a systems engineer on a well-functioning homebound spacecraft, I had a little more time to look out the window and gawk and be less concerned with things than my two partners, who still were supervising and carrying out experiments. And I was working too, but they were responsible for that. So I had the chance to look out and look at the heavens and be a little more of a tourist on the way home. And we were in the plane of the ecliptic, and perhaps many people saw one of the recent the lunar eclipse last night, as a matter of fact.
Right. This is being recorded on the 21st of February, folks, and you'll hear this toward the end of the month or early March.
So we were in the plane of the ecliptic, which is a plane containing the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun, and oriented perpendicular to it and rotating in order to keep thermal balance on the spacecraft. And that allowed the view of the Earth, the Moon, the Sun, and a 360-degree panorama of the heavens to appear every 2 minutes in the spacecraft window. And this was utterly magnificent view, and you must recognize that in space the stars are 10 times as bright and 10 times as numerous as you can ever see on Earth, and that's because of the lack of intervening atmosphere. And it's much closer to what we can now see with the Hubble telescope pictures that's brought back from Hubble. And anyhow, I recognize in looking at this that from my studies of astronomy at MIT and Harvard when I was getting my doctorate, that the molecules of my body and the molecules in the body of the spacecraft and my partners had been manufactured in some ancient generation of stars. And instead of intellectual knowledge, it was suddenly a visceral recognition, an insight, accompanied by ecstasy, and I'd never had this experience before. It was just overwhelmingly powerful. And every time I looked out the spacecraft window in the midst of my duties for the next 3 days, I was overtaken with this insight and the power of this. And I realized that for all time, we humans have asked the very deep questions about who are we, how did we get here, and where we're going. And each generation and each civilization has had its answer. But that now we were a spacefaring civilization, and my generation was the first generation of spacefarers, that maybe we needed to re-ask that deep question from this point of view. And I recognized that our story of ourselves, the cosmology of our science, was certainly incomplete and perhaps flawed. And the story of ourselves, as told by our cultural cosmologies rooted in religion, was probably was archaic and perhaps flawed. And maybe we needed to re-ask that question. So here I came home with this experience happening for 3 days coming home, just blowing me away. And I got home, started looking in the literature to find out what all this meant, and could find nothing in science and nothing in this religious literature. So I turned to some scholars over to nearby university, Rice University in Houston, to be specific, and asked them to help me. And very shortly they came up with, out of the ancient Sanskrit in India, several thousand years old, the description called Salvakapa Samadhi, a mind state in which you see things in their separateness and in the way we see them, but sense them internally as a unity, as a oneness, and accompanied by ecstasy. And I said, well, when they presented this to me, I said, that's exactly what was happening, is that I could see all of this, but I was feeling absolutely blown away and excited and overwhelmed by the utter beauty and the unity of all of this. So I then, from that point, started delving into the cultures of various civilizations. And I talked to medicine men and kahuna in Hawaii and shamans from Tibetan Buddhism and the mystical and spiritual leaders of as many different cultures as I could get a hold of, and found that in every culture of the world, these types of experiences were somehow recorded in the lore and in the literature or in the verbal lore of that culture. And I realized that that was a common experience of we humans, and that it is probably rooted in the very fundamental ground of our being. Some would call that God, but I would call that the zero-point energy field.
Well, this leads me into what I thought was one of the most powerful reading experiences I've had in a long time. And the whole book is powerful, and it's very coherent. What's so exciting about it is that so often the material that we are dealing with is not quite coherent, and because people are struggling with their inner focus, we don't know quite where we are with this yet. But you seem to, very much so. And anyway, Chapter 25, Portraits of Reality, it brings up things like the proposed multidimensional universe being one result of the search, and then speculations as to the world disappearing when no one is looking. In other words, the speculation that everything is in superposition, and I think most of my listeners know what that is, but in any case, superposition is a state where an electron or any subatomic particle is not in any particular place. It's nowhere and everywhere at once until it's perceived, whereupon it becomes a particle again. And is it possible, do you think, to use this principle, this fact of nature, and it is a fact of nature because we can actually detect it. We know that it's true. In meditation in some way, to allow our minds to expand, as it were, into the universe. And we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. God help you.
Well, so certainly what you've just described is a fundamental enigma of the basis of quantum mechanics. But Einstein and Bohr all argued about it, and that was Einstein's statement: does the moon go away when you close your eyes and you're not looking at it? And, of course, we know it doesn't. But at the very basis of the particle wave argument at the bottom of quantum mechanics is this superposition principle, where we can't really know exactly where a particle is at any given time. We can only know it probably. And so let's not get into all of that at this point because it's so very basic to some very arcane arguments. But the universe as we perceive it is it's just like we see it, except for the fact there is just this level down deep that things are happening kind of very much like at the subatomic level, the way they're described in quantum mechanics in this way. It's exciting because that is the basis. It's the fundamental basis for how our world is put together.
Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, a man who has now journeyed far, far beyond the moon, as close to the edges of the universe as I think we have as yet gotten. His new book, The Way of the Explorer, don't miss it. And don't miss his website, Dr. Ed Mitchell, Apollo14.com, and the Institute for Noetic Science awaits your interest and participation. Ed, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Whitney. It's been good to talk to you as always.
Yes, indeed. Last summer, one of the most astounding UFO events of all time took place when these strange objects we have come to call drones began appearing. First there was the Chad drone, crystal clear photo imagery. Then there was the Big Basin drone. Then there were other drones. Then there were witnesses who had seen them in the past, witnesses that Linda interviewed. In their frantic attempts to debunk this, everyone who was interested in doing so carefully ignored those interviews. Well, now there are new interviews, new witnesses. Need I say more? Go to earthfiles.com every day to keep up with this amazing, fast-breaking news. And here she is from Albuquerque, New Mexico, our award-winning science reporter, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thank you, Whitley. It's about a year ago. It was on May 11th, 2007, the Coast to Coast AM webmaster, Lex, received an email letter with several images attached of a very odd dragonfly-shaped aerial object from a Central California resident who called himself only Chad. The images were dated May 6, 2007, and Lex called me up to take a look because he wanted to know if I'd ever seen anything like this before, and I had not. Now, in addition to the dragonfly-shaped body that had appendages sticking out from a large ring, extending from the ring straight up into the air were slightly curved, thin wires that formed a tall, circular, almost crown-like appendage above the dragonfly body. And Chad was worried about his family's safety and health since he had now seen this bizarre aerial object at least 8 times from his house and on hikes near his home. Neighbors, he said, had also seen this unidentified aerial object, and no one knew what it was. Other photographs of dragonfly-shaped aerial objects began to emerge between May and June 2007, coming from Lake Tahoe, Capitola, and Big Basin, California, all with appendages sticking out from a ring and those tall, thin wires extending high above the dragonfly body. By June 17, 2007, I received by post office mail a dozen clear paper photographs dated June 5, 2007. This was a more menacing-looking dragonfly-shaped aerial object, much more complicated than the other shapes. I had taken to calling these drones because eyewitnesses had the impression that the hovering craft that made no sound were not manned. The dozen photographs were from a man who called himself Ty B and explained the photographs were of a large thing that had come above him and others while they were bicycling in the Big Basin Redwood Park near Saratoga, California. Ty said that all saw the dragonfly-shaped craft fade in and fade out 3 times above them. It was on the 3rd appearance that Ty was able to take the 12 photographs which he sent to me. After the Big Basin craft, no other photographs of the mysterious dragonfly-shaped drones emerged. But in January of 2008, I received the following email from an Earth Files viewer in Van Buren, Arkansas, a suburb of Fort Smith. Quote, "Dear Linda, it was suggested that I send you a letter to let you know that I'm pretty certain I saw a drone in Fort Smith. What was strange is at first I believed it to be a helicopter, and then I realized it wasn't making any noise like a helicopter. So I looked again, and I saw that wire cone-shaped part sticking up and realized that I was seeing what I had seen at your website. I was so shocked, I didn't think about getting someone to take a picture of it. My cell phone isn't a new one, so my camera on my phone is not good. Anyway, I saw it for what it's worth. Signed, Melody McIver Thaxton, and she gave me permission to use her real name and location. I called Melody and learned that her sister had a sighting also in June of 2003, 4 years before all of this excitement. And her sighting was in the very small rural town of Hartshorn. Some people call it Hartshorn, but most people who live there call it Hartshorn, Oklahoma, about 2 hours southwest of Van Buren and Fort Smith. So I called the sister, who she requests anonymity, but she was willing to talk on the record about what she says is the most extraordinary object that she has ever seen in her life.
I went outside on my porch, and I saw what I thought was an airplane, and it got closer and closer, and it had all kinds of arms and legs on it and spirally things and lights all over it, and it had writing on it. The writing, it looked like a foreign language. And then it just kind of hovered. It didn't, like, fly. It just hovered. And then I finally went inside, and then I saw it again maybe a couple of days later, but it was in the evening. And it was doing the same thing, and it was around the same area. And it just kind of hovers.
What color are you seeing, and how close do you think it is above where you're sitting on your house porch?
Sort of a grayish color, or like a pewter, like a metal.
Mm-hmm.
As far as distance, like a helicopter before it lands on the ground.
Do you think that would be like 50 feet above you?
Maybe a little bit more than that.
Do you have any trees?
Yeah, there was some trees but it approached and got past the trees where I could see it better.
And when it passed the trees, were the trees 50 feet high or shorter or taller?
Oh, the trees were much shorter, but it approached and got past the trees, but it was, it was still above the trees.
I see. Okay. Now, how close do you think that it got to you on the porch?
It didn't get much closer than that.
About 50 feet, maybe.
Yeah.
Now, the color is a pewter gray.
Mm-hmm.
Could you see writing because it was a different color?
The writing was like a darker color than the pewter, like a black. It was a dark
black on the gray.
Yeah.
What was the shape of this aerial object?
Oh, that's hard to describe. It was sort of like flat and round both.
Did it look anything like a dragonfly? A long tail with a round front or anything like that?
Sort of. It had so many protruding, like, legs and arm type of things on it.
Right.
The body of it, it's like it didn't have much body to it. But it had a lot of these extensions out from it. Sort of like a dragonfly, except it had a whole bunch of these arms or legs or whatever.
Okay. And the writing was where?
The bigger part, the bodice part of the thing.
The body, a longer piece that the projections came from?
Right.
This black writing. Do you remember any of the shapes?
They were squiggly, almost like either Eastern type language, like an Egyptian writing or Jewish writing. It was a foreign type that was all squiggly.
You used the word spiral things coming off of the main longer body. When you say spiral things, what do those spiral things look like?
I don't know how to describe them. Sort of like other little arms, when they come out, like a spider, sort of, like something that has the ability to turn in any direction.
As this approached you, it stopped still in the air?
Yeah, it just sort of hovered.
And when it hovered, did it turn or rotate in any direction?
No, but the lights on it were changed at different times. Now, the little arms and stuff like that, now they moved around, but the main part of the craft itself didn't really turn or anything. It just kind of stayed hovering there.
Okay. So the slightly longer body part
right.
is staying stationary, but you could see with your own eyes that those spider-like arms coming off of the body, did they rotate? What did they do?
They just kind of moved around in different directions.
So in the twilight, sitting on the porch, when it's at its closest and it's stopped, you're seeing the lights. What color are they? Where are they on this body, and what do the lights do?
They're just light. I didn't see any color to the lights. All I saw was like light.
White?
Yeah, like white lights.
And where were they?
They were on the body part, the bigger body part, and they were also on the arms, and there were several on those spirally type things.
Now, were the spiral type things, did that look like wires curving up into the air above the flat body?
I could just tell that they were there.
Were you seeing it at 50 feet approximately above you, only the bottom of it, or could you see a profile of it?
It was more of a profile, like part of the front and part of the side.
Were all of the lights along that body and where the legs were, did they form any kind of a pattern?
Some of them seemed to take turns lighting up. Like they would gradually all light up one at a time and be all lit, and then they would go off, and then they would do it again.
So it was kind of a constant lights coming on, and then did they all go off at the same time, and then?
No, they were all in different places doing this weird light on, light off kind of thing.
Okay. Was there any time when it did not have any lights showing?
I don't think so.
So there was this active white light activity all over the body of this object the whole time.
Right.
How big do you think those lights were?
Some of them were smaller. Some of them were about the same size as the tips of my fingers, and some of them were larger.
Where were the larger ones?
In the bigger, like the smaller ones were on the smaller, the spirally things, and the larger ones were on the leg things and part of the bodice.
Did you see all of those legs move at one time or another?
I saw the the smaller ones moving some, but not the larger ones. The larger ones were just still.
How long did you sit on the porch and watch this object hovering above you?
Oh, my. The first time I saw it, probably, I don't know, maybe 45 minutes, an hour, long time.
And during that time, did you ever hear any sound from it?
Like a humming or a buzzing sound.
Could you try to mimic that for me now? Steady, or did it go off and on, or?
Kind of off and on.
Did you ever think about calling the police or a fire department or somebody to come take a look?
I contemplated actually sharing it with a neighbor or a friend or something, but I actually, to be honest, I was afraid that they would think I was crazy and and not really listen to me, because I did discuss it with my husband later. I talked to him about it and told him what I saw. He just kind of shook his head and said, I probably just saw a satellite. And I told him, no, it wasn't a satellite. You know, living out where I was at, we're talking about hillbilly authority. They would just think that you were drinking or something. Anyone that would take it seriously or want to check it out was way too far away to get there. Because any place like that or any authority, it would be like 2 or 3 hours away.
Wow.
Because it's little, way rural, way out in the country. So,
are there any military bases?
Yes. McAlester, Oklahoma they make ammunition and they test it. It's called the Army Ammunition something. I can't remember, and it's over McAlester.
And McAllister's how far from Hartshorn?
It is like 30 minutes maybe.
So very close.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And at the end of this hour watching the object in the sky, what happened? Did it leave or what?
It just, like it went backwards, kind of gradually faded. Just couldn't see it anymore.
When it began to move away from you, did you notice any change in the color of the light, the intensity of the lights, the number of lights? Did anything on it change when it started to move backwards?
It seemed to brighten up more.
Did it go back away from you very slowly?
No, it actually seemed to move kind of fast. It was surprising. I actually wondered if it wasn't something from the government, like a secret project of some kind.
The object moves away from you.
Mm-hmm.
Describe what happens as it's moving away.
It just kind of gradually fades. It just kind of disappears. It was as though it was never there.
How many days or nights later was it when you see it a second time?
It was close. The timing was close. I remember that. It was within the same week. It was evening time, and I thought I saw just a bright star at first from a distance, and then it got closer, and I pulled into my driveway. Where I lived at, it was on top of a hill, so I had a really good, clear view of the sky. And as it approached, I realized it was the same thing again, but it wasn't as close as it was before.
And you knew it was the same because why?
I don't know. I just knew it was the same thing. It was just, I guess because, well, I could see that there were more lights on it, and it just seemed to hover like before. And I just felt like it was the same thing.
Did it come close enough for you to hear that hum?
No.
Did it stop in the air?
It was doing the hover thing again.
And this time, how close did it get to you after you got out of the car?
Oh, it was further, a lot further.
If it were 50 feet before, what would you guess the second time it was?
Oh, it was probably about 200 maybe, 100, somewhere like that. It was quite a bit further.
Okay. But you do see it stop.
Yeah.
And then what happened?
It just stayed there for a while.
And did you just stand out in the yard, or did you?
Yeah, I watched it for a while, and I kind of knew what to expect, but I knew that it was time for my husband's call. He works away, and he calls at a certain time, and so I went in.
The lighted object was still there, hovering in the sky.
Yeah.
And you get through with the phone call. Do you go back out?
No, because we talked for a long period of time on the phone back then.
So you do not know what happened to it, but as far as you're concerned, two of these odd dragonfly-shaped objects, one in the twilight and one at night, came within 1 week to where you lived in Hartshorn, Oklahoma, probably June of 2003.
Right.
Now, when I interviewed her, she did not have any computer ability to receive images. And finally, we set up a day with a neighbor so that I could send her 7 images spanning some of the various shapes that had occurred between May and June in 2007. And she called me back, and she said, Linda, it's number 7. That's what I saw. And Whitley, number 7, was an angle on one of the big basin, menacing-looking machines. And when I realized that that is what had been hanging maybe 50, 60, 70 feet above her for an hour, I couldn't believe it. But I asked her, I said, we're now looking at this photo. Do you see that basket thing that hangs down underneath it? She said, oh, yeah, that was moving. That was moving a lot. And I said, well, what do you mean moving? She said, you know that those cage parts, they come up and it would move up. These things would come apart like a basket coming apart, and then they would come down together, and then they would go up, and then they would come down. I said, did you see any kind of a beam or any kind of a light or anything that was moving in or out of that basket? She said, no, it just was moving like all of those other parts. Incredible.
Oh,
now,
my God, Linda.
Now, we're not quite through because
No.
after this, I talked with the sister about what she saw in the middle of November 2007, months after all of the excitement.
I was leaving the building where I work, and I went to my car, and I looked in the direction where I was fixing to drive out of the parking lot. And there's a building, there's a business that's next to where we're at. Above that, I see this thing in the corner of my eye. And at first I thought it was a helicopter. And I thought, wait a minute, that's not a helicopter. I realized that there was no sound. You know how much sound helicopters make, especially if you're in a vicinity. This was not making a sound. And I realized I was looking at what appeared to be like those pictures I'd seen of the drones, which had this weird, funny, metal-looking shape thing on it, and it looks like it's got a tail, like a long, flat tail sticking out.
Well, we've talked in 2007 about a dragonfly shape. Would this be like a dragonfly?
Yeah, kind of like that.
A long tail that has...
That's the best way. I mean, if you want to compare it to something, yeah, I guess so. There's not anything that I've ever seen anything like that.
It was so unique.
Yeah, exactly.
Were you seeing this aerial object because it had lights on it?
No, it wasn't dark. There was no lights on it at all. I mean, it was still daylight, and it was hazy outside. Like it might rain, but it's not going to rain for a little while.
Okay, hazy gray.
Yeah, hazy gray. And it was in pretty clear sight, and there was another person, and I think they were a customer of where I work. They looked up and kind of looked at me and said, are you going to get a picture of that? And I said, all I've got is my camera phone. And I started to go back to the building to see if I could find a photographer that was still there. And as I was going back to the building, the thing just kind of dissipated. You could tell it was moving slightly, but it wasn't moving very fast.
So it just sort of faded out?
Yeah, it just faded out.
You know the profile in the photographs at Earth Files, all of them have prongs or some kind of wiry structure going straight up into the sky.
Yeah, that's what I was telling you, that stuff that stuck out.
So you were seeing those prongs sticking up in the sky above the body.
Yeah, that's why at first I thought it was a helicopter when I looked at it. And then I had to do a double take because there was no sound. And then I realized it wasn't the right shape for a helicopter. It definitely had those prongs on it going up.
Now, your sister said she could see what she called the spider legs sticking out from the longer body. Some of them were moving. Did you see any of the projections off of the main body moving?
No. Evidently, from the way she described what she saw it at a closer distance. Mine was further away, and I couldn't see anything moving, and it was pretty hazy, but the thing itself was just kind of like floating, and it had these metal things going up, almost like a funnel shape, the way it would go up, like it was like an upside-down funnel.
Right.
And then it had like a tail sticking out that was metal-like. And it was basically slowly moving towards the west. When I realized what it was and that it was not a helicopter because there was no sound, it didn't move away fast. It just disappeared, kind of dissipated, like a cloud of smoke.
That was November of 2007. Had you talked with your sister about what she had seen 5 years earlier before?
No. I went to a Christmas get-together, and we were just sitting around talking about things, and she had never brought this up. And I had told her, I said, you want to hear something odd that happened to me recently? And I told her about what I saw, and she said, that sounds exactly what I saw a few years back. And I said, what did you think it was? She said, I thought it was like some kind of spy equipment. Part of the thing is that most people around here, if you tell them you saw something like that, they think you're crazy. I haven't really discussed it with a whole lot of people because of that reason. So this is the Bible Belt. Not saying that Christians can't believe in UFOs, but a lot of them, they discourage it.
And when I sent her the same exact 7 photos that I had sent her sister in Oklahoma, the picture, she did not know what her sister had selected. And Melody picked out the Chad photo from early May as being the closest to what she had seen in the middle of November of 2007, 5 months after all of the last excitement in June. So Whitley, I think that these 2 sisters are describing exactly what we had photos of in the May-June period of 2007, and yet one sister in Fort Smith, Arkansas, Van Buren area sees what looks like the Chad shape, and the other sister, 4 years before, in 2003 June, sees what we all have considered to be the most amazing, the Big Basin, huge, complicated, menacing-looking machine. She sees in Hartshorn, Oklahoma in 2003, and neither sister had talked with each other until Christmas of 2007.
Well, Linda, you know, it is a truly extraordinary story, and I'm sure you're aware of the fact that between February 12th and 14th, there was a meeting at the UN, which actually did happen. I have confirmed that after some initial confusion, shall we say, between 3 senators, some representatives of the National Guard, the Air Force, the Papal Emissary, and representatives from the various G8 countries trying to discuss what to do about all of these incredible UFO sightings that are happening around the world. Because it's not just us. It's Turkey, it's England, it's Iran, it's Iraq, it's Russia, it's everywhere, all over Europe.
And Mexico.
South America, and Argentina. It's a worldwide, undeniable phenomenon, and so close to us now, we can practically touch it. So they decided that if it continued like this in 2009, there would be a change in policy, or they would recommend. These were below the ambassador level. They were certainly not going to be making any policy, except for I believe a couple of the ambassadors were there and senators. But in any case, they would recommend change. They would recommend that we begin to admit that there is somebody here and that we study them. Unfortunately, in the translation I saw from France, they referred to our neighbors, and it's the wrong word. They do not know as much about this as you and I do by any means.
Right.
And neighbors is not a neutral word. It is no smarter to say neighbors than it is to say aliens. We need to go in between, which is visitors.
Right.
And there was also some comment about the abductees and the witnesses, and in general, they were not looked upon very favorably by this group. Of course, it's because they represent the one thing that is truly difficult about this and the one thing that cannot be controlled, which is the fact that, sightings aside, the place we see them most often where we would least like to is our own bedrooms.
Right. Yes, what an irony. That there is debate about whether to open up the truth about other life in the universe when it has been interacting with this planet for millennia.
Well, exactly. And however, I have to tell you also that I wonder if our admission or our official admission that this is real won't be some kind of a tripwire and open a door that we can never close again, that has never really been open throughout all of human history when we have been denying them or confused about what they were or thinking they were one thing when they were actually another, and by that very process, keeping them at arm's length. If we embrace them, I think they're going to prove to be too hot to handle.
Well, I don't think the word is embrace. I think that what we need to do is say we're going to finally be on a planet where there is truth about the fact that we're not alone in the universe, and that we have to be as careful about the other intelligences as we are about strangers on our own planet.
Right. I agree with you completely, Linda Moulton Howe. Thank you very much. Folks, next week we're going on a completely different trip on Dreamland. We had Edgar Mitchell this week. Next week we're going to learn a little bit about something I knew nothing about and decided, well, heck, who knows what this is all about. We're going to find out something about voodoo next week. And Linda, do you have any idea what you might have for us?
No, I go week by week about what is newest.
Very pleased and proud to welcome an extraordinary man who I am happy to call an old friend as well. Edgar Mitchell. Ed is one of the people who actually walked on the moon. In fact, he's the sixth man to walk on the moon. I'm sure every one of you know exactly who Ed Mitchell is. He literally needs no introduction, but what does need an introduction, and it's getting it here, is an extraordinary book, The Way of the Explorer. Larry Dossey said of it, and I thought this was particularly apt of the many, many comments that Edgar got for this book. In the history of the human race, 12 people have set foot on the moon. Now, one of them has written an important book, an account of a modern-day hero's journey. Like the mythical heroes of legend, astronaut Mitchell pursued a vision, ventured on a quest, risked great danger, and obtained uncommon wisdom. He has returned to share it, and we would be wise to listen. Yes, indeed, we would. And over the course of the program, as I am sure Edgar well knows, we will be talking also about aliens. By the way, for you subscribers, one of the other people who has given Edgar a lovely quote for his book, Lynn McTaggart, is our featured subscriber interview this week. And Ed, I think in view of that, I might start out by departing a little bit from, if I have a script, and I never really do, and asking you what your thoughts are about the Lynn McTaggart and the intention experiment. We're going to get into the quantum physical nature of consciousness as Ed sees it a little later, but let's just start there since we're talking also today to Lynn McTaggart.
I have skimmed her new book. I have not personally read every word of it through, Whitley. But, of course, her first book, The Field, I'm very intimately involved with. And I appreciate Lynn's approach. I know that she's a very thorough researcher, but I can't speak to the details of this newest book because I haven't read it word for word all the way through yet.
Well, let's really, I guess I misspoke myself because I meant to say that I'd like to talk about the theory of the field and to
non-locality and resonance that are the aspects of the quantum world that are vitally important here. Entanglement is this notion that subatomic matter that becomes in a process, and even if the particles go apart from each other, even across the universe, they remain entangled in some very mysterious way, such that if you do something to one particle, the other one immediately and instantaneously responds regardless of where it is in the universe.
Right, and the interesting thing about this is, folks, this has been physically proved. It's not.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, there have been experiments that have shown this is definitely real.
Yes, that's correct. It is a real phenomenon. And that just shows that it goes right to the heart of the fact that the universe is mysteriously in some way interconnected, and we would call this an informational interconnection at that level that still has a lot of mystery associated with it. And non-locality, which is part one of these, coherence, that these two particles are coherent in a way. A way to think of coherence, if you think of it as light waves being coherent, it means that their waves are all lined up kind of in a row like soldiers marching, as opposed to being like just ordinary light coming in where the waveforms are in all sorts of angles and not lined up in any way. The light that comes through your window and from the sun is not coherent light, but laser light is coherent light. And laser light is what we've discovered. But what we've now discovered is that that nature was using this property long before we discovered it, and that's quite that's a very interesting observation. And then non-locality is the idea that this information between the two is transported, or is the interaction is instantaneously recognized, regardless of where the other part is in the universe. Well, this kind of challenges Einstein's concept that information doesn't move faster than the speed of light. But here we have validated that this is absolutely true, that it does. Exactly how this happens, still the methodology and the mechanism for it is still very elusive, but the fact that it does
move from that into your idea of quantum awareness.
Okay.
And I think that I think you could probably make it a bit more of a response to that.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I certainly agree that in recent years we have, and fortunately in large measure due to some work a colleague of mine did that Lynn McTaggart's quite well aware of, Dr. Walter Schimp in Germany discovered this process called quantum holography when he was doing work with improving MRI machines. He's an MRI expert. And it really brings into clear focus the role of the quantum world in our perceptual machinery and in the concept of the quantum field as an underlying aspect of nature that we're just now really starting to learn a bit about. And primarily because for 80 years since the discovery of quantum mechanics, the particle physicists have insisted that it really didn't pertain to our scale size, that this was a property only of subatomic matter. Well, it so happens that it may be a property of subatomic matter, but it has enormous influence because we have a lot of subatomic matter in us too, on the way humans function, and particularly our perceptual machinery.
Exactly, and this is incredibly important because let's talk about a little bit about the so-called quantum perception problem, so folks can get a bit of an idea about just how important this actually is. Because if perception influences reality or even assembles reality in some way, then our place in the universe is actually very different from what we've assumed. Wouldn't that be true?
That's absolutely correct. And what we're getting past here is the classical physics that stems from the time of Isaac Newton. But for our readers to understand this, that the Cartesian duality from René Descartes of the late 16th, early 17th century came to the conclusion that body, mind, physicality, spirituality belong to two different realms of reality that don't interact. That's not in question anymore. And a couple of other things to illustrate this among we humans is a so-called twin effect, that twins who are on opposite sides of the country from each other or around the world from each other might on even any given day dress in the same color clothes or have the same sort of thoughts or be in kind of communication with each other. Another example is mom and dad go out for dinner at night and leaving Johnny at home with a babysitter, and halfway through dinner, mom jumps up and says, "Oh, something's happened to Johnny." Calls home, babysitter answers, says, "Well, yes, he fell out of his high chair onto his head and bumped his head." Well, that's the type of information. We call it quantum coherence or quantum entanglement and quantum resonance that allows that to take place. And go ahead.
Now that we're seeing this, it becomes possible, and this is what why I see such a relationship between your work and the work of someone like Lynn McTaggart, is that you are leading the way into a new possibility, which is that once we understand the theory that would explain what is now dismissed by science as mere psychic activity or superstition, then suddenly everything changes, because in the quantum nature of the mind, once we understand this in our linear mind, it's going to enable our quantum mind to function more freely. Now, Edgar, we've come to the quantum minds. We've come to the end of our first segment, so we're going to stop here for just a moment, folks, and we'll be right back. Today I'm talking to one of the great explorers of our time, Dr. Edgar Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell's new book is The Way of the Explorer, an Apollo astronaut's journey through the material and mystical worlds, and it is powerful. This is a working document for those of you who are working on creating or recreating your mind as a quantum mind, and I know a lot of you are, because this is what we work on in our meditations all the time in the subscribers section. Well, this book helps, because
now the fine aspect of that, the positive aspect of that, was it got the Inquisition of the Church of that period off the backs of the intellectuals, and they quit burning them at stake and torturing them on the rack, which was what the Inquisition did in those days with dissenters. And it did allow a science, as we now understand it in the classical period of Newton and the early great thinkers, to arise. But it has progressed for almost 400 years with religion on one hand and science on the other, and never the twain shall meet, until the 20th century and quantum mechanics came along and clearly indicated that there was something here wrong with that notion that body, mind, physicality, and spirituality don't interact. And it's very clear that they do interact now. And that is the major contribution in the 20th century here of quantum mechanics, and particularly the new stuff that's been going on in just the last few years, thanks to much of the work that I've been doing, Lynn McTaggart's been doing, and many of the great thinkers associated here with the consciousness movement.
Now let's talk a little bit about quantum awareness and how it's different from ordinary awareness. And in this audience that you're talking to now is engaged in an intense search. It's an audience of about 250,000 people. And they are not like your usual radio audience. These people they know what this is. So when we talk about quantum awareness, you're talking to people who are actively engaged in trying to rethink or re-experience their awareness and the way they work in relation to the universe itself.
Okay, well, maybe I can lay a little background here that at least from the academic end and the teaching end and the scientific end, that helps get the proper idea across. Because we need to understand what is different about classical thinking in physics and in science rather than quantum thinking in science. And it has to do with four properties of nature that define the quantum world, and that is entanglement, coherence,